Then, one physician made a phone call that would change the course of human history. He called the government. He asked for penicillin. The substance was so rare, so precious, that treating Ann Miller would consume half of the entire supply in the United States. Half. For one patient. The government said yes. Within hours, a small vial arrived. Doctors administered the drug. Within 24 hours, Ann's fever broke. Within days, she was eating solid food. Within weeks, she walked out of that hospital. She lived another 57 years. Before you hit that subscribe button, understand this. What saved Ann Miller was about to save millions. And when the men running America's war machine realized what they had, the entire strategic calculus of World War II shifted. The men in the Pentagon's upper echelons were not medical doctors. They were strategists, calculators of losses, masters of logistics and supply chains. By early 1943, these generals and admirals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been receiving reports from military hospitals that defied belief. Soldiers with compound fractures and osteomyelitis, infections so deep in the bone that sulfa drugs were utterly useless, were walking again. Men who should have lost limbs were keeping them. Casualties who would have been written off as fatal statistics were returning to duty. The numbers told a story that made even hardened military commanders pause. During the Great War, between 12 and 15% of wounded soldiers treated in frontline hospitals died from infections. Gas gangrene alone turned battlefield injuries into death sentences. The bacterium Clostridium perfringens thrived in the mud-soaked trenches of France, invading shattered tissue, releasing toxins, necrotizing flesh faster than surgeons could cut. The mortality rate from gas gangrene in World War I stood at 10 to 12% of all deaths from wounds. World War II was different. By 1943, military medical reports from North Africa and Sicily documented gas gangrene mortality dropping to between 0.3 and 1.5%. Overall infection mortality was falling below 3%. Penicillin was doing something unprecedented. It was keeping soldiers alive at rates that rewrote the mathematics of warfare. The implications were staggering. Armies do not fight with guns alone. They fight with men. Living, breathing, repairable men. Every soldier saved from infection was a soldier who could fight again. Every prevented amputation was a trained rifleman, a tank driver, a pilot who retained his full capability. The strategic value was incalculable. In January 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the War Production Board. Its mandate was simple: supervise the production and allocation of everything needed to win the war: materials, supplies, services. The WPB had authority over steel, rubber, aluminum, fuel. By 1943, it also controlled penicillin. The board's analysts ran the projections. If penicillin could reduce battlefield infection deaths by even 10%, the lives saved would number in the tens of thousands. If it could prevent amputations and speed recovery times, soldiers would return to combat weeks or months earlier. The drug was not just medicine, it was a force multiplier. The Joint Chiefs understood force multiplication. When they received briefings on penicillin's effectiveness, when they saw the data from early military trials, they made a decision that rivaled the strategic importance of radar, the Norden bombsight, and the Manhattan Project. Penicillin production would become a national priority. But there was a problem, a catastrophic, almost insurmountable problem. In March 1942, treating one woman consumed half the penicillin in America. Producing the drug was agonizingly difficult. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, returning from vacation to his disorganized London laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital. A petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria sat uncovered. A blue-green mold had contaminated the culture. Most scientists would have discarded it. Fleming looked closer. Around the mold, the bacteria were dead. The mold Penicillium notatum, secreted a substance that killed bacterial cells. Fleming called it penicillin. For 12 years, that discovery languished. Fleming lacked the funding and technology to purify and mass-produce the mold juice. He kept the Penicillium strain alive in his lab, distributing samples to researchers, hoping someone could transform it into a usable medicine. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, working at Oxford University, took up the challenge in 1938. Chain developed a purification method, freeze-drying the penicillin juice repeatedly. The process was slow, exhausting, and inefficient. Another researcher, Norman Heatley, improved it by adjusting the pH, the acidity of the solution. On May 25, 1940, they tested their refined penicillin on 8 mice, infected with lethal doses of streptococcal. 4 mice received penicillin, 4 did not. The untreated control mice died within hours. The treated mice lived. Heatley recorded in his diary that night, "It really looks as if penicillin may be of practical importance." He was so excited he put his underpants on backwards in the dark when he finally went home at 3:45 in the morning. Florey and Heatley tried to scale up production in Britain, but British pharmaceutical facilities were already manufacturing sulfa drugs, vaccines, and other medicines for the war effort in Europe. So in July 1941, they crossed the Atlantic to the United States. They brought with them detailed notes, cultures of Penicillium notatum, and a desperate plea for help. They convinced 4 pharmaceutical companies to join the effort: Merck, E.R. Squibb and Sons, Charles Pfizer & Co., and Lederle Laboratories. The team headed to Peoria, Illinois, where researchers at the Northern Regional Research Laboratory had perfected fermentation techniques for industrial-scale production. The Peoria scientists made a breakthrough. They switched the nutrient base from glucose to corn steep liquor, a waste product from cornstarch processing. Penicillin production increased 500 times compared to the yields in England. Then they found an even better strain. A laboratory assistant walked through a Peoria grocery store, examining overripe fruit. On a moldy cantaloupe, she found a variant of penicillium that produced even more antibiotic. That cantaloupe mold became the genetic ancestor of most penicillin produced for the rest of the war. But even with these improvements, production remained painfully slow. In early 1942, the entire United States produced only enough penicillin to treat a handful of patients. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America entered a war on 2 fronts, and the military's demand for penicillin exploded. The War Production Board investigated 175 companies. It selected 21 to participate in a coordinated penicillin production program. The board allocated resources, coordinated supply chains, and imposed strict controls on distribution. Penicillin was reserved exclusively for the armed forces. No civilian could legally obtain it unless they were part of a clinical trial or an exceptional case like Ann Miller. By August 1943, production reached many millions of units. By September, the stockpile was sufficient to meet the demands of the Allied armed forces. The companies were producing penicillin faster than anyone had thought possible. The cost plummeted. In 1941, extracting enough penicillin for a single dose cost $20, equivalent to $500 today. By the end of the war, the same amount cost 3 cents. Pfizer took the biggest gamble. In September 1943, the company purchased an abandoned ice plant on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn. The building had industrial refrigeration equipment, perfect for controlling the temperature of massive fermentation tanks. Pfizer converted the facility into the world's first large-scale penicillin factory. On March 1, 1944, it opened for production. 14 tanks, each holding 7,500 gallons of fermentation liquor, churned day and night. Within weeks, Pfizer was producing more penicillin in 1 month than it had in all of 1943. Most of the penicillin that went ashore with Allied forces on D-Day, June 6, 1944, came from that Brooklyn plant. But production was only half the battle. The military needed to know if penicillin actually worked under combat conditions. Laboratory mice were one thing. Wounded soldiers bleeding out in field hospitals were another. In early 1943, the U.S. Army Medical Corps initiated its first large-scale penicillin trial at Bushnell General Hospital in Brigham, Utah. The hospital housed over 200 war-related orthopedic patients. Most had compound fractures, bones shattered and protruding through skin, complicated by osteomyelitis, bacterial infection deep in the bone marrow. Sulfa drugs did nothing for osteomyelitis. These men were considered hopeless cases. The infection would spread, the bone would rot, and amputation was the only option. Many would die anyway. The Army Medical Corps classified the Bushnell program as intent to treat, not a formal clinical trial. They gave these dying men penicillin because there was nothing left to lose. The drug was administered both systemically, injected into the bloodstream, and locally, packed directly into the infected wound. Dosages were optimized. Side effects were meticulously recorded. The results were so encouraging that the Army immediately opened a second testing center in June 1943 at Halloran General Hospital on Staten Island, New York. Another 200 wounded soldiers received penicillin. Again, the outcomes were extraordinary. Men kept their limbs. Infections cleared. Both hospitals became penicillin therapy training schools where Army medical officers learned how to administer the drug. But the United States was late to battlefield testing. The British had been running trials since July 1942 in Cairo, Egypt, during the North African campaign. Using penicillin supplied by Florey's Oxford team, British military doctors treated wounded soldiers in forward hospitals. They learned a critical lesson. Timing mattered. Administering penicillin weeks after wounding was too late. The infection had already spread, the tissue already necrotic. Penicillin worked best when given immediately, within hours of injury. The British moved their trials forward, closer to the fighting. Field hospitals in North Africa began using penicillin in active combat zones. By 1943, the drug was being tested under fire in Sicily and Italy. The conditions were brutal. Desert heat, tropical humidity, flies swarming over open wounds. Supply lines stretched thin, yet penicillin performed. In December 1943, Sir Alexander Fleming himself, along with Howard Florey, traveled to North Africa and Italy to observe penicillin's use in combat. Fleming, the man who discovered the mold in his London lab 15 years earlier, stood in field hospitals and watched his accidental discovery save men's lives in real time. The data from these trials flowed back to Washington and London. Medical officers compiled reports. Statisticians analyzed mortality rates. The numbers were undeniable. Penicillin reduced deaths from bacterial infections in wounded soldiers from 18% in World War I to less than 1% by the end of World War II. Gas gangrene, the terror of the trenches, was nearly eradicated. The infection rate dropped from 10 to 12% of all wound deaths in the Great War to 0.3–1.5% in World War II. Amputations fell dramatically. Using standard pre-penicillin methods, about 8% of patients with severe infections required amputation. With penicillin, that rate dropped to 3%. The reduction in mortality and long-term disability was not just a medical triumph, it was a strategic weapon. By late 1943, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had the data. They understood what they possessed. Penicillin was the difference between an army that could sustain prolonged campaigns and one that would be bled dry by infection. It was the difference between soldiers who could return to the front lines and soldiers who would be crippled or dead. The Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The landings at Normandy would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Tens of thousands of men would storm fortified beaches under withering fire. casualties would be catastrophic. The wounded would number in the tens of thousands. Without penicillin, a significant percentage of those men would die not from bullets or shrapnel, but from infections contracted in the days and weeks after injury. The Joint Chiefs demanded more penicillin. The War Production Board responded. Scientists worked around the clock. By May 24, 1944, less than 2 weeks before D-Day, enough penicillin had been stockpiled to treat all anticipated battle casualties in the invasion force and in the emergency medical service hospitals in Britain. The Ministry of Health in the UK issued instructions to hospitals on May 30, 1944. Treat battlefield patients en route. Administer penicillin as soon as possible after injury to prevent gas gangrene and sepsis. On June 6, 1944, 2.3 million doses of penicillin accompanied the Allied forces onto the beaches of Normandy. The drug performed as expected. Hundreds of personnel were treated for infected wounds in the aftermath of D-Day. The results were impressive. By one estimate, penicillin reduced the number of lives lost by Allied forces on that single day by 12 to 15%. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the restrictions on penicillin for civilian use began to relax. In July 1944, the War Office approved the use of American-made penicillin for medical conditions in service patients and for air raid casualties among civilians. By March 15, 1945, penicillin was available over the counter in U.S. pharmacies. The war in the Pacific presented different challenges. Tropical diseases ravaged American forces. Malaria infected an estimated 60 to 65% of American troops in the South Pacific at some point during the war. In the Milne Bay campaign in New Guinea, the disease incidence reached 4,000 cases per 1,000 soldiers per year. Essentially, every soldier contracted malaria at least 4 times annually. Medical personnel estimated that malaria casualties outnumbered combat casualties by a factor of 7 to 10. Penicillin could not cure malaria. The disease is caused by a parasite, not a bacterium. But penicillin could treat the secondary bacterial infections that often accompanied the fever, malnutrition, and weakened immune systems of malaria patients. It could treat infected wounds in the humid, bacteria-rich jungles, where even minor cuts festered into life-threatening infections. And it could treat gonorrhea, a sexually transmitted disease that was rampant among troops stationed in unoccupied territories. The Japanese forces, by contrast, suffered catastrophically from disease. They lacked sufficient anti-malarial drugs and had no access to penicillin. On Buna in Papua New Guinea, an estimated 45% of Japanese soldiers died from malaria and related infections. The disparity in medical capability contributed directly to the collapse of Japanese defensive positions. Penicillin's impact extended beyond the battlefield. It revolutionized the treatment of venereal disease. Gonorrhea, resistant to sulfa drugs, responded immediately to penicillin. Soldiers diagnosed with gonorrhea could be treated and returned to duty within days instead of weeks. This was not a trivial concern. Venereal disease rates among troops were high enough that they represented a significant drain on manpower. Penicillin allowed the military to maintain troop strength. By the war's end, penicillin production had reached industrial scale. The cost had dropped from hundreds of dollars per dose to mere pennies. What began as a moldy petri dish in a London laboratory had become one of the most mass-produced substances in the world. In 1945, Alexander Fleming, Ernst Chain, and Howard Florey were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of penicillin and its curative effect in various infectious diseases. But the story of penicillin in World War II is not just a story of scientific discovery or industrial production. It is a story of strategic decision-making by military leaders who recognized that medicine was a weapon of war. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not need to be convinced of penicillin's value by abstract scientific arguments. They were convinced by data, by survival rates, by the sight of men who should have been dead or crippled walking out of hospitals. By the cold arithmetic that one bottle of penicillin could keep a trained soldier in the fight. When they realized that penicillin could save 90% of battle wounds from fatal infection, reducing mortality from bacterial complications from 18% to less than 2%, they did not hesitate. They mobilized the full power of American industrial capacity. They turned pharmaceutical companies into weapons factories. They allocated resources, prioritized supply chains, and ensured that every medic, every field hospital, every surgeon on the front lines had access to the drug. Before penicillin, soldiers feared infection more than bullets. A shattered femur, a lacerated abdomen, even a deep puncture wound carried a high probability of death, not from the trauma itself, but from the bacteria that invaded afterward. Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, Clostridium. These microscopic killers turned battlefield injuries into prolonged, agonizing deaths. Penicillin changed that calculus. A soldier who took a bullet to the leg and survived the initial trauma had a better than 90% chance of surviving the infection if he received penicillin within hours. That knowledge changed the psychology of combat. Men fought with the understanding that a wound was no longer a death sentence. Medics worked with the confidence that their efforts were not futile. Families received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands, and fathers were wounded, but expected to recover. Ann Miller, the first American civilian treated with penicillin, lived to the age of 90. She died in 1999, 57 years after lying on her deathbed in New Haven Hospital. In those 5 decades, she witnessed the complete transformation of medicine. Penicillin became the foundation of modern antibiotics. Derivatives and synthetic variants proliferated. Diseases that once killed millions became treatable, even trivial. But in 1942, when half of America's penicillin supply was poured into her veins, she was not a statistic. She was a woman dying from an infection that medicine could not cure. Until it could. The soldiers who stormed the beaches at Normandy, who fought through the hedgerows of France, who crossed the Rhine into Germany, carried with them a weapon their fathers in the Great War never had. It was not a gun. It was not a tank. It was a small vial of liquid, pale yellow, derived from mold, capable of stopping an invisible enemy that had killed more soldiers throughout history than all the bullets and bombs ever made. The Joint Chiefs of Staff saw the reports from Bushnell Hospital in Utah. They saw men with compound fractures, bones protruding through infected flesh, osteomyelitis eating through marrow, given penicillin as a last resort. They saw those same men, weeks later, walking. The bones healed. The infections cleared. The men returned to duty. They saw the reports from North Africa, from Sicily, from Italy. They saw gas gangrene mortality rates collapse. They saw amputation rates fall. They saw recovery times shorten. And they understood. This was not just a medical breakthrough. This was a force that could turn the tide of the war. So they mobilized. The War Production Board coordinated the largest pharmaceutical production effort in history. 21 companies, hundreds of fermentation tanks, thousands of workers, billions of units of penicillin. By D-Day, 2.3 million doses. By the end of the war, enough to supply civilian populations. By 1945, penicillin available over the counter in American pharmacies. The transition from scarcity to abundance happened in less than 3 years, from half the national supply used to save one woman to enough to save millions. That pace of transformation was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate, strategic decision-making by military and political leaders who recognized the stakes. Churchill's pneumonia in 1943 was cured by sulfa drugs, not penicillin, because penicillin supplies were still limited and reserved for military use. But British newspapers hailed sulfa drugs as the miracle that saved the Prime Minister. They had no idea that an even more powerful drug was being stockpiled for the coming invasion. Sulfa drugs discovered by German chemists in the 1930s had been the first broad-spectrum antibiotics. They saved tens of thousands of lives in the early years of World War II. Every American soldier carried packets of sulfa powder in his first aid kit with instructions to sprinkle it on wounds immediately. British and German soldiers did the same. But sulfa drugs had limitations. They were ineffective against certain bacteria. They caused side effects, including nausea and allergic reactions. And crucially, they could not treat syphilis or sulfonamide-resistant infections. Penicillin had fewer side effects and broader effectiveness. It worked against bacteria that sulfa drugs could not touch. It cleared infections faster, and it could be administered in smaller doses. By 1944, sulfa drugs were being phased out in favor of penicillin. The transition was not immediate. Sulfa drugs continued to be used throughout the war, but the strategic emphasis shifted. Penicillin became the primary antibiotic. The Germans never developed penicillin on an industrial scale. Intelligence reports after the war revealed that German scientists were aware of penicillin's potential. They had access to Fleming's published research, but they lacked the industrial capacity and the coordinated effort that the Allies mustered. Some historians speculate that the lack of penicillin contributed to Germany's eventual defeat, as infection rates among wounded German soldiers remained high throughout the war. The Japanese were even worse off. They had no effective antibiotics. Malaria and tropical diseases devastated Japanese forces in the Pacific. Infection rates from battle wounds were catastrophic. The disparity in medical care between Allied and Japanese forces was so extreme that it functioned as a form of asymmetric warfare. When Norman Heatley sat in his Oxford laboratory on May 25, 1940, watching infected mice die while penicillin-treated mice survived, he could not have imagined the scale of what he was witnessing. He recorded in his diary that penicillin may be of practical importance. That is the understatement of the 20th century. Penicillin did not just save lives. It enabled the Allied victory. It allowed armies to fight longer, sustain higher casualties without collapse, and maintain troop strength despite horrendous battlefield conditions. It turned wounds that would have been debilitating or fatal into injuries that could be treated and healed. The Joint Chiefs of Staff understood this. When they saw the data, when they calculated the strategic value, they committed the resources necessary to make penicillin available on an unprecedented scale. And in doing so, they saved hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions when counting the soldiers who survived wounds that would have killed them in any previous war. Ann Miller's story is often told as the beginning of the antibiotic age. And it is, but it is also the story of what happens when medicine and military strategy intersect. When the people with the power to mobilize resources recognize that saving lives is not just a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity. The soldiers who landed at Normandy did not know that the vials of penicillin in their medics' kits represented the culmination of years of scientific research, industrial coordination, and strategic planning. They just knew that if they were hit, if they survived the initial trauma, they had a chance. A real chance, better than any soldier in any previous war. That chance was penicillin, and that chance won the war. March 14, 1942, New Haven Hospital, Connecticut. A 33-year-old woman named Ann Miller lay dying. Her temperature spiked at 106 degrees. Her body burned from the inside out. Streptococcal septicemia, blood poisoning, was consuming her one cell at a time. The doctors had tried everything: sulfa drugs, blood transfusions, every treatment in the American medical arsenal. Nothing worked. Her organs were failing. The hospital staff prepared for the inevitable.